I wanted to begin by introducing the two people who are on the chancel this morning. When I first came here, that are special guests, that are not just the clergy who work here all the time, who are also special. When I first came here, people said sometimes that in the past, sometimes clergy or spiritual people would appear on the chancel. They didn't know who they were. They had no idea, who these people are. Then they would disappear mysteriously. So I'm taking this intentional moment to introduce them to you so you know who they are. Sherry Hilliard is in the membership class currently. She is a retired MCC minister, and she pastored churches in Oklahoma City and Corpus Christi, other places around Texas, and now she finds herself here serving among us as a volunteer and as a new member of our church. So we are grateful to Sherry for her ministry. And Nora Sanchez may not be familiar to you if you come at 9, but she is the music director for the 1 o'clock service, Congregación Latina. I have been to that service a number of times, and if you've never been, I urge you to visit part of our church, the 1 o'clock service. Nora does the music there, and the music is an essential part of what makes that liturgy beautiful and transforming. So she's an artist, a musician, a minister of music, and a member of our staff. So would you welcome Nora to this service? So I've been away all week. It's been lovely to be away, and it's been lovely to come back. And one of the things I wanted to testify to, since I have complained at times in a whining manner that I'm not proud of about the weather in Texas, that I spent all winter praying for weather like this. So I just want to say, God answers prayers. Not all the time, maybe not for the rest of the summer, but this week I felt it, and I know you did too. I was away at a conference that I try to go to every 2 or 3 years, the annual meeting of the Hymn Society of the United States and Canada. The Hymn, H-Y-M-N, Society is a group devoted to congregational song, the history of it, the encouragement of it, the cultivation of it. We did nothing but sing for 4 days, and it was heavenly. I really loved it. Perhaps you've seen the movie or the play Trip to Bountiful, in which Geraldine Page is admonished by her rather stern daughter-in-law, no hymn singing in the house. Well, this week, for 4 days, there was hymn singing all day, and I thought this is what heaven might be like, at least for people like me. There were 400 of us, and it's a very specific kind of gathering, but I felt at home, that feeling that you have sometimes when some very specific part of you is acknowledged and welcomed and you can participate in. I felt like, my people, and I loved it. And I loved being able to tell them about the incredible music at Cathedral of Hope, which is part of our spiritual practice here. I literally had people come up to me in Columbus, Ohio, and say, I watch your church on the internet. And these were total strangers to me. And it was useful to receive this feedback from others, the appreciation for the music ministry, the appreciation for the internet presence and the internet people who make our presence possible. And I was just glad to talk about a church, our church, where music is so esteemed and such an integral part of our practice. So I wanted to make those acknowledgments too. Sometimes it takes being away to appreciate what you have all the time. So I hope that you have that opportunity this summer, if you're away, to appreciate what you have here at Cathedral of Hope. I want to talk this morning about suffering, the meaning of suffering, and also how the Spirit attends to us in the midst of our suffering. It was a week where, I suppose you could say this about any week, where terrible things happen, and I was affected by it, as I know other people were. But this week really did seem to have more difficult news to absorb. And I'm thinking specifically of the ongoing conflicts in Israel and Palestine, where children's lives and adult lives continue to be lost. I know it's a complex political situation, but the suffering of the children there especially, we can't afford to be ignorant of it or oblivious to it. And also the downing of the Malaysian aircraft carrying so many people, a tragedy in and of its own right. The fact that a number of them were AIDS researchers on their way to an international AIDS conference only intensified that sense of loss or tragedy. And the politics are opaque to me. I don't really understand exactly what is happening in the Ukraine and Russia, but I do know that what happened there was wrong and terrible. And I had so many people mention it to me that I just wanted to acknowledge in church that these sufferings are real, they happen all the time, but this week especially, they seemed prominent, foregrounded. And I do believe our spirituality, our spiritual tradition, Christianity, addresses the meaning of suffering and encourages us and assures us that no suffering goes unaccounted for, no suffering is meaningless, and that I believe our faith speaks directly to what it means to suffer, to experience suffering. And I know that people individually have situations in their lives where they're in touch with that. I also know that collectively we're aware that there are sufferings. Sometimes they seem to be caused by nothing that we can account for, no sense. Other times they seem to be the result of human error or sometimes human intention. We intentionally cause suffering to other people. So I do believe our faith speaks to it, and this passage in particular from Paul's letter to the Romans. Now, I don't lightly preach from Romans. It's not my favorite book in the Bible. If I had to pick a least favorite book, it might be Romans, it might be Leviticus, hard to say. But, not every book is equally loved, let's just say. Paul, writing to the Romans, as Paul does in all of his writings, had very specific situations in mind. And it's easy to dismiss Paul as crotchety or worse, mean, on the nature of some of his writings, so this isn't one of those passages. But it's important to remember that he was not Jesus, first of all. Some Christianities overly emphasize the teachings of Paul as if he were Jesus. Paul never met Jesus in the flesh, though he had spiritual experiences of him. And he's a teacher, and I think to keep his teaching in perspective, some teaching is correct, some teaching is incorrect. So not every word, to me, is the same in the Bible. And to me, the teachings of Jesus far outweigh the teachings of Paul. When Paul writes, these are letters. We're really reading other people's correspondence. It's like looking at their email, almost. And it's possible that it could be on point for something that's going on in our lives. But it's also true that they were written for particular situations. So it's always important to read what's around a text, to read the whole thing, to look at what was particular that Paul was addressing about that church in Rome at that time, in this case, or what might be musings or insights that are bigger than the particular situation. And I think that this passage on suffering is one of the examples of Paul's sterling insights about spirituality. It is one of the most beautiful sections of Romans, and you have to read the whole book to really get the point, even if the first chapter is a little off-putting. By the time he gets to the 8th chapter, he's found the groove, and it's good stuff. So he begins by saying, and he uses the metaphor of children, the experience of children, and I want to lift that up as the way to think about this. What does it mean to be a child of God? What does it mean to long for adoption? What does it mean to want to be included and cared for and protected? That's God's will for us. I really believe that. And when we experience suffering that undermines our feeling of well-being in the world, that's not God that's doing that. That's human evil, or sometimes things beyond our control, even God's control, I think, at times. Paul says this, "For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God." And I think that's an important statement right there. Everyone is a child of God. Now, we don't always proceed as if we believe that, and the world doesn't always reflect its reverence for every child and every person as if they were made in the divine image. Tomorrow, President Obama will likely sign a presidential order that will ban discrimination against LGBT people who work for companies that have government contracts. And we're told that he will not have, yes, that there will not be an exemption for religious organizations in this, because how horrifying, Christians sometimes oppose anti-discrimination policies, and this one in particular, as part of their religious practice. I do believe this is contrary to the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Paul. This statement, this bold statement by President Obama, reminds our whole society that everyone is a child of God. He may not use religious language, but it's an affirmation of that. And I think it's important to lift that up in church too, especially because so many churches will be preaching against what he's about to do tomorrow, today, but not ours. And we are not the only one that will not be. We are all children of God, for you didn't receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you received a spirit of adoption. That means that God intends for us to feel included, confident, to move through the world safely. When we cry, Abba, Abba means daddy. We could say it means mom, mommy. It's not father or mother. It's an intimate term, that primal cry that we make at times. Perhaps you've had this experience, even as an adult. And I think I'm conscious of this week because my father's death anniversary was this week. His birthday would have been at the end of the month. My mother's birthday, who's no longer alive, was also earlier this month. And I still find myself at 56 sometimes thinking, Mom or Dad. It's not a rational thought, but it's a deep impulse that is within us. And it's natural to cry out in that way in times of fear or anxiety. And this is what Paul likens the spiritual life type. When we cry out, Mom, Dad, it's a cry for God as well as a cry to human parents. And God hears and notices and cares. And that's the kind of relationship we're meant to have with God, not fearful, but one of an intimate parent who cares for us and loves us, who chooses us, if you will. And if we are also children of God, it says, we are also heirs of God, joint heirs with Christ. If in fact we suffer with Christ, so will we also be glorified with Christ. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. These are some of the hardest words and some of the most beautiful words. If I were to pick the heart of the epistle to the Romans, I would say, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us as the heart of this. It acknowledges the reality of human suffering. It doesn't try to deny it, doesn't try to sugarcoat it or whitewash it or make it go away. It is an acknowledgement that there is suffering, and at times it's terrible. I remember 35 years ago in college, I had a professor, a theologian from Germany named Dorothy Sola, and she said, talking about suffering, about the death of the daughter of a fellow theologian, Elizabeth Kazimon, who was killed in South America during the political troubles there. This was the poem she quoted in her lecture, and it imprinted on me. A rose is a rose is a rose is a rose, said Gertrude Stein, the mother of modern aesthetics. But a woman dead is not a woman dead, is not a woman dead, is not a woman dead. By which she acknowledged that we must never forget or trivialize or diminish in any way the reality of human suffering. It's the most important thing that happens, I think, at times. And any attempt to deny it or to cover it up is contrary to God's will. But he also says this: suffering, while real, is an indication of the restoration, the glory that is to come. I know this to be true, that loss or grief is a marker to us of how great our joy will be at the restoration that we will experience someday. That the reality of grief or suffering is also something to prod us to anticipate and expect that God will restore what has been lost, that God will assure us in our suffering that we will be vindicated someday. And he uses this talking about the first century in which he lived, but I think it speaks to today. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. The creation, everything in the world, waits for the revealing, the coming out, if you will, of the children of God, the appearance of the children. The children are what tell us about the future. The children are the indicator, the metaphor for our whole spiritual lives, and how we treat the children is all about how we care about the Spirit. I want to lift up, I know we'll be talking about it in a few weeks' time more, the plight of children who are refugees right now, who are coming to our country from Central American countries through Mexico. Some of you know I was in El Salvador earlier this year, and it's not a surprise to me that children are fleeing and that parents, out of love for them, are sending them away. When I was in El Salvador, I witnessed poverty, violence, treachery, like we barely ever see here. And for the people that I witnessed in El Salvador, they don't see the borders. They see America as a place that has partly caused their suffering politically, and that is true, and also as a place that they're connected to. You know, they use American currency in El Salvador. There's not this notion that they're separate necessarily. They're moving towards safety. They're not invading our country. And how we respond to these children are such a marker about what we care about our spiritual lives. These children, whatever your politics, whatever you think about the United States' involvement in the politics of Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador in the past or the present, the fact is, right now, there are children here, and they're coming, and they're not here to invade. They're coming seeking refuge and safety. It's a natural impulse. It's not, the borders that we are so firm about are invisible from space. And I think that they're invisible to God. I don't think they're important. I'm not saying they don't have significance. But I know that my colleague at First Baptist Church, Pastor Robert Jeffress, when he says that the most compassionate thing that we can do for immigrant children right now is to build a fence across the Mexican border, I know he's wrong. I really believe that to be true. This is a person whom I know is familiar with the book of Leviticus. He likes to quote it. He has favorite verses. This is the verse I want to remind him of. Leviticus 19, 33 and 34. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreign-born residing among you must be treated as native-born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners once in Egypt. Our biblical tradition is full of stories of people migrating from one place to another, sometimes by choice, sometimes not, seeking safety, seeking security. If we're going to look at the book of Leviticus, this is the chapter to look at, and these are the verses to consider. The governor of Massachusetts, Devil Patrick, announced this week at a press conference that, with several religious leaders, that they were creating a home for 1,000 children in Massachusetts as soon as they can. This is what he says: I believe that one day we will have to answer for our actions and our inactions. My faith teaches that if a stranger dwells with you in your land, you shall not mistreat them, but rather love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, Patrick said, quoting scripture as he grew visibly emotional. If you get a chance to see the video of that, it is very moving. And this is the teaching that I believe we must bring to bear right now in society. I think it is separable from immigration reform, although I also believe that immigration reform is necessary. And that's a teaching consistent with Christianity. Caring for the children is the most important thing. I was reminded this week, and that's why I included it in the worship order, about Perry Klaas's novel about being a pediatric AIDS physician during the early 90s, and how she found it important to dream about how the world would be different. She didn't lose hope, and she considered it a great privilege to be able to care for other women's children who had been placed in her care. And she treated them as if they were her own. And she dreamed about a world in which her work would no longer be necessary. I think it's important for us to dream about that world where immigration reform isn't necessary, because children are cared for wherever they are. It doesn't matter what nationality they are. I had an experience this week of being reminded of what it means to have your situation noticed by people who are not part of your situation. And this, to me, is the ultimate spiritual test about our solidarity. Will we be passionate about inclusion on behalf of people, even if they're not present in the room to defend their own interests? Or is it something we only do or only cooperate with if they raise it themselves? This is the experience I had at the Hymn Society. Now, the Hymn Society is not the most liberal group of people. It's kind of an apolitical group of people, more than anything. They just love music. They'll sing anything. And it's true. So this week, and so people come from different denominations, and they share what's happening in their churches musically, and there's no politics, supposedly. So there's a denomination called now the Community of Christ out of Independence, Missouri. But their former name, until recently, was the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They're the Mormons who only went from New York to Missouri, but no further. Who knew, right? Okay. And then they're dwarfed in size by the larger Mormon church. And the Mormon church generally disdains them, doesn't see them as really Mormon. And the people where they live, though, see them as Mormon, and so there's some stigma associated there. So they're not the most popular group. And they're tiny, but they were proud to have a new hymn book. And they got up in front of the Hymn Society. They gave us all copies of their new hymn book. And they said, you know, we had a revelation through our prophet a few years ago that God loved gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender children as his own. And so we voted in our assemblies to include GLBT people in ordination to the priesthood and to open marriage to them. And we want to make this statement. Then they had us sing a hymn from their hymn book about welcoming gay people into their churches. I mean, you know, it was the moment where the polite Hymn Society people were really kind of on edge, because the rule is you'll sing anything, right? But it's not the most progressive group of people. But everybody got up, and sure enough, they sang this hymn about welcoming gay people into the tiny little Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And they were so proud of this revelation that they wanted to share it in their moment in the sun. This was one of the verses. It talks about, oh, we pray for all the young lives cut short by fear and shame, so afraid of who they are, whom they love. May the message now be banished that your love is for the few. May their faith in you renew. Oh, may our hearts and minds be opened. Fling the church doors open wide. May there be room enough for everyone inside. For in God there is a welcome. In God we all belong. May that welcome be our song. This is a verse specifically that they included and had commissioned, addressing the plight of teenagers who end their lives out of shame for being gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. It's so specific and so real that I couldn't believe they were willing to take a public stand like this, and not only that, but to use their moment to evangelize for this position of inclusion. I'm not thinking of converting to the Community of Christ or the reorganized Latter-day Saints Church, but I learned something spiritually from them about how we care for children reveals how God cares for us and how we care about God. They understand something that I hope the broader church will understand. Paul ends his letter with these words: "Who hopes for what they see? We hope for what we do not yet see." We have to continue to imagine that the suffering of children is not inevitable and that we can play a role in overcoming the injustices that have led to the situations where children's lives are considered expendable. The children wait with eager expectation for God's love and for ours. My prayer for us is that in the weeks to come, we will understand what role we can play in saying to children everywhere, we care, we love you, you belong. Amen.